Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I'm seriously so excited to be your guide today as we unpack a really fascinating and honestly pretty heartbreaking chapter of history. We're diving into the impact of colonialism in India. And look, I know history can sometimes feel like just memorizing a bunch of old dates, but it's really about understanding how massive policy shifts completely flip the daily lives of ordinary people upside down. So get comfortable, grab your notebooks, and let's jump right in. Okay, to start us off, I want you to just imagine something for a second. What if a total stranger suddenly walked into your house, claimed they owned the place, put a huge padlock on your fridge, and then started charging you money just to eat your own food? You'd be absolutely shocked, right? I mean, the sense of injustice would be off the charts. Well, hold on to that feeling, because that exact scenario, that literal house takeover, is basically what the Adivasis, the indigenous tribal communities of India, experienced when the British colonial government suddenly seized control of their ancestral forests. So, here's our game plan for today. First, we'll look at the takeover of the forests. Then, we'll see how local businesses were completely strangled. And finally, we'll explore the grueling everyday life of the factory worker. Let's get going. All right, part one, the takeover of the forests. Let's mentally step back into the vast, incredibly peaceful Indian forests way before the British even arrived. For literally centuries, the Adivasis and local villagers lived in total harmony with these woods. It's actually wild to consider the stark contrast in how the land was treated. The Adivasis treated the forest as, well, a home. They gathered wood, hunted, grazed cattle, all super sustainably, just for their basic needs. They never just blindly chopped down trees for profit. It was more like, cut a small patch, let new trees grow. Simple, right? But as cities like Kolkata and Mumbai started booming, the colonial government looked at those exact same forests and they didn't see a home. No, they saw a massive warehouse, just waiting to be emptied for commercial timber, for ships, mines, and pure profit. Now, to really grasp why the British needed so much wood, we need to quickly define a crucial term: sleepers. Basically, sleepers are those heavy, wooden planks that you lay horizontally across railway tracks to hold the metal rails in place. And because the British were expanding this massive railway network all across India to move troops and resources around, they needed these specific wooden blocks. Not just a few, they needed millions of them. The sheer scale of the deforestation was just staggering. Workers were basically forced to convert these massive saw logs into railway sleepers, especially in places like the Singhbum forests. Get this, by the year 1910, the British had laid over 50,000 kilometers of railway lines. That required a mind-blowing 1 crore, 10 million wooden sleepers every single year. They were literally ravaging the forests just to feed this huge industrial machine. So, to control all this precious timber, the British set up a forest department in 1864 and rolled out these terrifying new forest laws. They literally locked the Adivasis out of their own homes. Traditional farming suddenly banned. Adivasis were beaten, they were hit with unjust fines just for stepping onto their own land, and forced to do begar, which is essentially free forced labor for the forest contractors. I mean, ask yourself, how would you react if you faced these daily tyrannical abuses right in your own backyard? Naturally, you'd fight back. And that brings us to the resistance. You know, it's really easy to just read a textbook that glosses over things and says, revolts happened. But those abstract revolts, they were driven by real flesh and blood heroes. Brave individuals who stood up to the absolute might of the British Empire with little more than bows, arrows, and just an unbreakable spirit. Let's talk about 3 of these incredible leaders. First up is Birsa Munda. Between 1874 and 1901, this incredibly young leader united the Munda Adivasis of the Chotanagpur Plateau. That's in modern-day Jharkhand. He was honestly revered almost like a god by his followers. He fiercely fought against the British, the zamindars, the moneylenders, all to win back traditional land rights. Tragically, he died in prison in 1900, but his rebellion was so powerful it actually forced the government to pass laws protecting Adivasi rights in his region. A real game changer. Next, we have Alluri Sita Rama Raju. When the Madras Forest Act of 1882 cracked down on tribal movement, Raju led a fierce, totally patriotic guerrilla campaign deep in the forests of Andhra Pradesh. Taking inspiration from revolutionaries in Bengal, he and his followers bravely raided police stations, actually stealing British guns and ammunition to fight back. He kept this up until he was ultimately caught and killed in 1924. And finally, Komaram Bheem. He managed to unite the Gond and Koya tribes with this one powerful, really unforgettable slogan, Jal, Jungle, Jamin, which translates to water, forest, and land. He literally formed a guerrilla army to fight the incredibly oppressive grazing taxes imposed by the local ruler, the Nizam, who was backed by the whole colonial system. Bhim fought valiantly until his very last breath in battle. These leaders really highlight the profound, deeply personal human cost of those forced takeovers. All right, moving into part 2, strangling local businesses. Think about a sports match for a second. What happens when the referee actively changes the rules mid-game so only one specific team can win? It completely ruins the game, right? Well, the British government acted exactly like a corrupt referee when it came to Indian industries. We can actually see exactly how rigged this game was. Back in the 1850s, courageous Indian entrepreneurs started opening cloth mills. They asked for a simple protective tax on British goods to help them survive, making foreign cloth just a tiny bit more expensive so locals would buy Indian cloth instead. And the crazy thing is, Britain had actually done this exact same thing to protect their own factories earlier. But in 1896, the government flat out refused. Instead, they placed a 3.5% tax on British imports and a matching 3.5% tax on Indian-made goods. It was a deliberate move to strangle local industry by refusing to protect those new, smaller Indian mills. But history is always full of surprises. During World War I, right between 1914 and 1918, a massive loophole accidentally opened up. European cargo ships were suddenly diverted for war duties, and British factories were totally consumed with making war supplies. Because of this, the flood of cheap British goods coming into India just stopped. This accidental shortage finally gave Indian factories the breathing room they desperately needed. Without foreign competition choking them out, Indian industries boomed, selling huge quantities of goods and developing super rapidly. Which brings us to part 3, the grueling life of the factory worker. So, while industries were finally growing and booming, we really have to ask ourselves, who was actually doing the heavy lifting on the factory floor? Just imagine the daily march to these mills. You're waking up way before the sun even rises, joining a massive line of exhausted men, women, and even young children. You walk into this building where the heat is absolutely oppressive, the air is just thick with suffocating dust, and the noise from the machines is completely deafening. And the wild part, this wasn't some kind of punishment. This was just a normal Tuesday for hundreds of thousands of Indian families who had packed up and moved to cities like Mumbai and Kanpur, basically just looking for survival. The actual facts of this factory nightmare are really hard to stomach. We're talking workers toiling for 14 to 15 hours a day, 0 official meal breaks. You literally ate your food in 15 minutes while a friend watched your machine. And if the machine broke down, even if it had absolutely nothing to do with you, the owner would deduct money directly from your wages. Oh, and here's a terrible twist of irony. The invention of the electric light bulb around 1880 actually made things worse. Before that, you at least got to stop working when the sun went down. But with electricity, the owners just kept those machines and the people running deep into the night. So you're probably wondering, why didn't Indian leaders try to stop this? Well, listen to this shocking quote published in a Bengali newspaper back in 1875. Rather than this new industry be destroyed, it is better that laborers keep dying in high numbers. I know, it's intense. But in that desperate rush to build a national economy that could somehow compete with the British, even some educated Indian leaders initially prioritized factory profits and mere survival over human lives. They genuinely believed that protecting workers would end up killing those fragile young industries. Slowly, though, painstakingly, rights were won. In 1881, a law finally banned children under the age of 7 from working. By 1891, women's working hours were limited to 11 hours a day. And it actually wasn't until 1911 that men's hours were finally capped at 12 hours. But here is a super wild historical twist for you. Do you know who was actually heavily pressuring the government to pass these Indian labor laws? British factory owners. Yeah, they weren't just suddenly being nice. They were terrified that Indian factories, using extremely cheap, unregulated labor, would outcompete them. So they actually used welfare as a weapon to try and slow down Indian industrial growth. Crazy, right? And that brings us to the end of today's incredibly layered explainer. We've seen it all, from the Adivasis losing their forest homes just for railway sleepers, to local businesses fighting totally rigged taxes, to factory workers literally giving their lives for industrial growth. So I want to leave you with a little bit of homework for your mind today. When a country develops and moves forward in the name of progress, who is actually forced to pay the price? Really think about that. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.